Hello, and welcome to the Education Table. I'm your host, Kelly Hart, and joining me today is the one and only Tyler Bennett.
Always great to be here, Kelly.
We've also got two fantastic experts joining us later, who are going to help us break down one of the most important laws in American education. IDEA is the federal law that guarantees students with disabilities the right to a free, appropriate public education. We call that FAPE. Before this law, many children with disabilities were completely excluded from public schools. IDEA changed everything by ensuring that every child, regardless of their disability, has access to education tailored to their unique needs.
And that wasn't always the case, was it? This took a lot of work to make happen.
That it did, Tyler. IDEA actually started as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, but we can't tell this story without our historian. Welcome, Dr. Turner. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, of course. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Turner, how did this all start?
Let's start at the beginning. On November 29, 1975, President Gerald Ford signed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or EHA, into law. For the first time, federal law guaranteed a free, appropriate public education to everyone between the ages of 3 and 21 with a disability in the United States. However, the hard federal mandate was most reliably enforced for school-aged children. This is where we see the birth of IEPs, or Individualized Education Plans, which are legal documents that outline specialized support services for students with disabilities to ensure FAPE. EHA also provided financial incentives to help states and school districts comply with the law. Now fast forward to 1986, the first major reauthorization signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. This one focused on our youngest learners. The law now required states to provide FAPE to children ages 3 to 5 with disabilities through a Part B amendment and created funds for early intervention services for children with disabilities from birth to age 2 through a new Part H, now Part C, of the Act, which provided federal grants for early intervention services for infants and toddlers with disabilities. The law recognized that it's not only the children that need to be supported, but the family as well. This is where we see the creation of Individualized Family Service Plans, or IFSPs. Think of these like an IEP, but for the whole family, outlining special services to meet the child's developmental needs. The one major flaw here is that the states were financially incentivized to implement Part H programs, but not required. Our next major update came under President George H.W. Bush in 1990. This reauthorization renamed EHA to the law's current name, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. In this reauthorization, Congress required schools to create individual transition plans, or ITPs, to help students prepare for life after high school. The law also formally defined assistive technology of devices and services for the first time, making them explicitly available as part of any child support plan. While this reauthorization focused primarily on school-age students, states utilizing Part H funding now had to collect and report data to increase accountability.
It really shows how the law was starting to think about the full lifespan of a student with disability, not just their school years.
Absolutely. Now, let's move to 1997. This reauthorization really shifted the focus under President Bill Clinton. The emphasis became improving results, not just access. Schools had to focus on getting students with disabilities into the general curriculum, not isolating them. This is also where we see Part H renamed Part C, and by this point, all states were participating in the program, meaning that for the first time, families in every state had access to early intervention services. States could also now identify students ages 3 through 9 with developmental delays. Before this, the developmental delay label was primarily used in children ages 3 to 5, with older children requiring a specific disability label to receive services. This update also added an explicit policy goal to encourage states to serve at-risk children under age 3 who did not yet have a developmental delay but could be at risk without early intervention. Then, in 2004, IDEA gets aligned with No Child Left Behind. Signed into law by President George W. Bush, this meant greater accountability, raised standards for special education teachers, and something new called early intervening services for students who might need extra support before formal special education identification. These changes were finalized in 2006 when the Department of Education published regulations requiring schools to use peer-reviewed, research-based interventions to identify and support struggling students. Now we're moving towards evidence-based practices, including prohibiting states from utilizing the traditional wait-to-fail IQ achievement discrepancy model. Now, states use more proactive, data-driven approaches to identify students earlier and are required to consistently monitor student progress to determine if the interventions being used are effective. Now, tell us, what has happened since then?
Well, it may come as a bit of a surprise that IDEA has actually not been reauthorized since 2004.
Well, certainly something has to have happened in the past 20 years.
Well, yes, we have had many updates to the law that have made quite an impact, although none of them have come under official reauthorizations. For example, in 2016, additional IDEA regulations addressed disproportionality, or the over-identification of certain students for special education. Districts with significant disparities in identification, placement, and discipline now have to use 15% of their IDEA funds to coordinate early intervention services. We also can't forget the 2017 Supreme Court case, Andrew F. v. Douglas County, which really defined the scope of FAPE requirements under IDEA. The case involved a boy with autism whose IEP goals had barely changed from year to year, with lower courts ruling that providing merely more than de minimis, or more than trivial, benefit was legally sufficient. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected that standard, with Chief Justice Roberts writing that a child receiving instruction aimed that low can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. The Supreme Court clarified that every child should have the chance to meet challenging objectives, not just minimal progress.
Dr. Turner, before we move on, what are the four main parts of IDEA that make this all happen?
IDEA is organized into 4 parts, A through D, and each one plays a critical role in the system. Let's start with Part A, General Provisions. This is where we find all the foundational definitions that make IDEA work. We're talking about key terms like child with a disability, FAPE, IEP, transition services, and the list goes on. Part A essentially provides the vocabulary and framework for everything else, including the rules for how IDEA is implemented and monitored in the states.
So that's the foundation. What about the actual services?
Well, that brings us to Part B, Special Education Services. Part B covers students ages 3 through 21 and provides the legal requirements and funding to ensure that all students with disabilities get the support they need in school. This is where IEPs come into play, and where schools are held accountable for providing appropriate services. Part B has specific indicators that measure both compliance and student outcomes.
And we mentioned earlier that the 1986 reauthorization focused on our youngest learners. That must be Part C?
Exactly right, Kelly. Part C, Early Intervention Services, covers infants and toddlers from birth through age 2. This part provides services and funding for our youngest children with disabilities and their families. We're talking about developmental screenings, family-centered services, and creating individualized family service plans, those IFSPs, rather than IEPs. The focus here is on supporting the whole family, not just the child, because early intervention works best when families are empowered and involved.
Tell me, when a child turns 3, how do they transition services from Part C to Part B?
This is a very thorough process, including child evaluations, transition conferences, and IEP meetings, all facilitated by Part C coordinators and local educational agencies.
That's fascinating and so critical that services aren't interrupted.
Absolutely. And finally, we have Part D, National Activities to Improve Education of Children with Disabilities. Part D funds competitive grants for things like teacher training, new technology, and resources to help parents navigate the system. Think of Part D as the support behind the scenes.
Excellent breakdown, Dr. Turner. Now, Tyler, who exactly qualifies for services under IDEA, and what disabilities are we talking about?
To qualify for services under IDEA, a student must meet 3 eligibility criteria. First, they must fall under one of IDEA's disability categories. Second, that disability has to adversely affect their educational performance. And third, they must need specialized instruction. So it isn't just about having a diagnosis, there needs to be something that impacts learning in a way that requires support. IDEA actually has 14 disability categories, and they're much more specific than people realize. The largest category nationwide is specific learning disability. That includes conditions like dyslexia and other processing disorders that affect how students read, write, or do math. Next, there's speech or language impairment. Then we have other health impairments, which is where ADHD falls. This category covers both chronic and acute health conditions that impact learning. IDEA also includes developmental and cognitive disabilities such as autism, intellectual disability, and for young children, developmental delays. This category is important because it allows states to identify multiple developmental areas that may have delays while avoiding assigning a permanent label too early. There are also emotional and behavioral conditions that are classified under emotional disturbance. IDEA also covers physical and sensory disabilities, including visual impairments, orthopedic impairments, traumatic brain injuries, deafblindness, and multiple disabilities.
My biggest takeaway from this is that there isn't just one type of learner that has an IEP.
Exactly, but here's where it gets tricky. While those federal categories are consistent across the country, each state sets its own criteria for who actually qualifies within them. Even with that inconsistency, we're talking about roughly 7.5 million total individuals receiving services under IDEA nationwide, including just over 450,000 infants and toddlers from birth through age 2 covered under Part C annually.
This all sets up a bigger question for me, which is if eligibility varies, what does this mean for equity? With this question in mind, let's please give a warm welcome to Equity Policy Analyst Dr. Evan Steven.
Thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Stephen, IDEA was born out of the civil rights movement and was meant to guarantee access and equity. But nearly 50 years later, is it delivering on those promises?
Well, that depends on how you look at it. IDEA has made an incredible impact on millions of students nationwide, but in many ways it has become a compliance-focused system with some deeply rooted inequities. Take identification rates, for example. Nationally, black students are significantly more likely to be identified under categories like emotional disturbance and intellectual disability compared to their share of the student population, even with federal monitoring requirements in place. That's the heart of the problem. While IDEA requires states to monitor significant disproportionality, each state sets its own threshold for what counts as significance. Different states also have different eligibility criteria, evaluation practices, and funding priorities. Congress has promised federal funding equal to 40% of the national average per pupil expenditure for students with disabilities since 1975. But this never happened. Actual funding has usually fallen below 20% of the national average per pupil expenditure. And now, the Trump administration is proposing to move Part D funding into Part B, eliminating dedicated funding for those national activities designed to improve education for children with disabilities that Dr. Turner spoke to us about earlier.
Dr. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
You know, Kelly, what strikes me most is how much IDEA has accomplished in nearly 50 years, but also how much work remains.
Absolutely. The law has evolved, but the gap between its civil rights promise and the reality of inconsistent implementation and funding is still very real. Well, that's all from us tonight. Thank you for joining us at the Education Table. I'm Kelly Hart.
And I'm Tyler Bennett.
And we will see you next time.